Now is the time for change. Doing business in the 21st century is made possible with Nkonki, external and internal audit assurance providers. Log on to nkonki.com to find out more.
Welcome to Doing Business in the 21st Century. Each week over the next 13, Mervyn King and I will be tackling an issue of relevance to people doing business. Our topics range from what makes for an ideal board to corporate reputation to integrated thinking. In today's program, we're covering corporate governance. What does it mean to the modern day business? Our expert guests are experienced company director, Dr. Leigh Roberts, and Faye Mukadam, a facilitator at the Institute of Directors, Southern Africa. I'm Leigh Roberts, and with me is Mervyn King. Mervyn, when things go wrong in a company, it's often attributed to a failure of corporate governance. Is that a fair assertion?
No, it's not. Because what happens inside a company, there's two things always happening inside a company. There's how people make decisions. That's the guideline set out in King 3. And then there's the business judgment decision. So the business judgment decision, none of us get that right 10 out of 10. We're dealing with uncertain future events. And we're taking risk for reward. We should be as a director. But when you practice non-quality governance and you get that judgment call wrong, that's when you get corporate scandal and probably corporate failure. But there are many instances around the world where people have practiced quality governance, discussed things with key stakeholders, made the judgment call, which turns out to be wrong and harmful to the company. They have a rights issue, and the rights issue is actually oversubscribed. So to attribute it solely to a failure of corporate governance, not that a failure of corporate governance cannot lead to scandal and demise, but it's usually in the circle with the business judgment that you have the wrong judgment call. But if you associate that with poor governance, that's when you get scandal and failure.
Yeah. Faye, do you share that view? Because we've had some high-profile cases. Enron, Lehman Brothers, even the BP oil spill was attributed to a failure of corporate governance.
I do share Mervyn's view, but I think that you cannot attribute it solely to governance failing, because governance is a system, processes, procedures, etc., that's also grounded or founded on a set of values. So at the end of the day, one has to consider who was involved in terms of applying their minds, their collective mind, to these uncertainties, all the different contributing factors facing the board at that moment in time. Was the control environment sufficiently robust? Did everybody have the appropriate skills and experience mixed around the table to make the correct decision with everything else that they were faced? So I don't think that it's always the system that's at fault. I think that one has to consider who the individuals are and what
so
they were
no generalizations here, except if in the case of Lehman Brothers, they had a retired admiral and a ballerina on their board. So
well, that goes to yes, who actually sits on the board. Absolutely.
And then, what is, to the new person coming into the business world, how would you describe what corporate governance actually is?
Corporate governance, very simply put, as Sir Adrian Cadbury has said, is the manner in which organizations are directed and controlled. So you have an element from a control point of view day to day, and the direction that is provided by the board, and the control is exercised via delegation of authority, and the execution is carried out by management. So corporate governance effectively is observing the manner in which organizations are directed and controlled.
So you could say it's also almost like the internal regulation of a company, and it's decided by the company, carried out by the company.
Well, it's observed externally, because you've got shareholder activists, you've got external shareholders, you've got stakeholders that are observing the manner in which the company is being directed. But internally, from a governance point of view, you've got checks and balances in place, including charters, frequency of meetings, the monitoring that takes place, and holding management to account. So that is an amalgam of what corporate governance is.
If you follow a code such as the King 3 Code of Governance, can you say that you have good governance in your company?
That's an interesting question. Just leading on from what Len's saying, the external environment changes constantly. So the company's governance framework has to reflect that change to maintain its relevance and make sure that it is contributing to all the shareholder and stakeholder needs. If you were to follow a code such as King 3, for example, then you are well on your way to having the foundations in place in terms of the guidelines, the roadmap, as it were. But of course, to follow it blindly in terms of just being compliance driven without it being based on a value basis, where we talked about courageous leadership and whether the board will ask and challenge challenge management and all the advisors in terms of what's being presented, then having the King 3 prescripts in place is not going to ensure a sufficiently robust model if it is simply based on a compliance approach.
And isn't that a problem with these codes of governance? With respect, being the King Committee, chairman of the King Committee, that they are dynamic, they become out of date.
The answer is, well, of course, once you write it down, it's not the law of the Medes and Persians that altereth not. It does alter. It alters because there are externalities, for example, the GFC. So nothing you write down is forever, because the society moves on, etc., etc. So you have to deal with that from a process point of view. But King 3, they are guidelines as to how to manage and how to direct, and on an apply or explain basis. In other words, it's flexible. And the issue is quality, not quantity. A company that sits down and does a checklist and ticks off, we have preponderance of non-executive directors with a critical bystander test, and forgets independence is really a state of mind, for example, then you're not practicing good governance, quality governance. It's actually a mindless, quantitative exercise, and this doesn't add much value. So the whole question is this board as a collective, its mind, being honestly applied in the best interests of the company? And that's an issue.
But isn't that a problem with companies today, Len, that they do simply go through the principles of King 3, tick it off, and hey, we've got good corporate governance?
I fundamentally disagree with that. Many companies that espouse the principles of King 3 have embedded many of the processes within the organization. So you look at the governance structure, you look at the control structure, the manner in which combined assurance is working, the independence of directors, the evaluation of their effectiveness as well as committees. So I would say a minority of organizations would follow the tick box approach, but many of them are embedding it because they see the value of good governance and walking the talk.
And it really is the judgment of the board in how they apply it, because of course it is on an apply or explain basis. So what does that mean, and how does apply or explain differ to comply or explain?
Well, Mervyn alluded to the flexibility espoused in King, which is apply or explain, in that if you look at what the guideline is and you apply it to your context with all its situational realities, does it make sense to apply it in the manner it is stated? And if you're going to deviate from the application, then simply explain why so, because the guideline is set at an international benchmark level. So if you are going to deviate in any shape or form, there must be some independent thinking and reasoning behind it, as opposed to it simply doesn't suit me, or it is a cost without benefit attached. The comply versus explain model is slightly different in that there is definitely a bigger stick approach with comply, and I think that's why the King Code allows the flexibility and why it is more applicable in a broader spectrum, because it is less attached to industry specific norms, less attached to size of company, different sector specifics, etc.
If I could add to that, Leigh, comply is legalistic in nature. And you'd have to comply or there would be penalties from a legal perspective. Whereas the apply, depending on the circumstances of your particular business, the size and the complexity, looking at King 3 in its present form, there are 75 principles. Now, if one takes King 3 and applies it to all organizations, including the non-governmental, the non-profit sector, you will find the remuneration philosophy or share options does not apply as far as that sector is concerned. So King gives you the flexibility of applying or explaining the exceptions.
Application.
Absolutely.
South Africa is known for a couple of things. good things. We're known for good corporate governance and integrated reporting, and it's all due to the King Committee and to you, Mervyn. In fact, I believe you're very famous in Japan, where they translated the King Code into Japanese. How did King 1 start?
King 1 started in 1992 when we were going into our new political dispensation. And I was approached by the Institute of Directors, the JSE, the Institutes of Psycha, and various bodies to form a committee to write down guidelines for the majority of our fellow citizens who had not been in the mainstream of our economy, how to direct, how to manage. Now, it was very special circumstances. In 89-90, Adrian Cadbury had written what became known as the Cadbury Report out of two scandals, corporate scandals in the United Kingdom, BCCI and Maxwell. And his remit was on, quote, the financial aspects of governance. So you will see still that focus on the financial aspects of governance. When I was asked to do it, and I was dithering whether to do it or not, I got a call from the great man himself, Mr. Mandela, who I knew before he went into jail and while he was in jail, and he phoned to talk to me about something. How's my favourite judge? Then I always knew I had to do something without remuneration. But he spoke to me what he wanted to speak to me about, and then I discussed with him this approach I'd had. And I said, I'm very busy, and I don't know if I should do it. Do it. You're the right man. So I did it. And one of my criteria was that you did it in the interests of South Africa, Inc., hand on heart, and no remuneration. And those very special circumstances, and if you look at the composition of the King 1 Committee, it truly was representative of our new Rainbow Nation. And we came up with this concept that you take account of the legitimate and reasonable needs, interests and expectations of your stakeholders of the company in your decision-making process. So it's part of that intellectual exercise of driving a decision in the best interest of the company. It might benefit one stakeholder more than another and cause harm to one stakeholder, but your explanation was it's in the best interest of the company for creation of total value, because we came to the conclusion that value, as we'd all been taught, as you were taught, Leigh, that value is the present value of discounted future cash flows. So we were looking at it through this financial lens, and certainly it never concerned me how the cash flow was created as long as it was being created. And we saw that in the new South Africa that this just wouldn't be acceptable. And so we came up with this idea of that you take account of their needs, interests and expectations in your decision-making process. And this process, it's extraordinary how it did go around the world. You mentioned I was then asked to chair the United Nations Committee on Governance and Oversight, and one of my committee members was Professor Shinji Hata, Dean of the Faculty of Commerce at Tokyo University. And he presented me with a book and he said, do you read Japanese? I said, no, not when I go to bed at night. But anyway, he said, no, this is your work of 1994, that was King 1. Translated in 1995 in Japanese. He said, you're better known in Japan than you are in South Africa. I said, yes, how come? He said, 120 million people in Japan, only 40 million people in South Africa.
So we're going to call you Mervyn Son from now on, and just so forward-thinking.
But it's interesting how I think the thinking coming out of the King Committee was driven by the special circumstances
of South Africa, just so forward-thinking. We're going to break now, but do stay with us. There's more on corporate governance when we come back.
Nkonki has the professional capacity to deliver on your external and internal audit assurance requirements. Visit nkonki.com